There's a number of reasons why you might be interested in the idea of character as an artist. You might be interested in designing your own characters, either for your own world, your own project, or to get a job as a character designer in some capacity. Or you might also be interested in writing your own characters, in thinking about character at a deeper level. One of the problems, though, is as an artist, we get hit with a lot of different advice about what character design means. For instance, if you start to learn about character from a visual standpoint, you get told to make the character look like who they are, to make it clear to the viewer what this character is all about, what this enemy is about, what this creature, what this monster, whatever it is. Often our goal is to be really clear and to be exaggerated about exactly who this thing is. You could contrast this perhaps with advice that you would get when you're writing characters, which is often that the actions that a character takes are really what defines their true character and who the audience or the viewer understands them to be. This is about ignoring essentially who they look like and who they say they are, and looking instead at what they actually do. And I think these approaches, you see, are actually in kind of conflict with each other. So what I want to do in this episode is unpack this and try and give you, if you're interested in going deeper with character, a bit of extra information and nuance to this idea of character and how you should view the external and the internal aspects of the things that you design. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name's Tim Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying art, creativity, productivity, and world building so that you can get better faster, create the projects that you've always wanted, and enjoy your artistic journey. So, is there a problem here? Let's look at, where I think a lot of the information we can get and our attitude towards creating characters can just get a little bit simplified and a little bit basic. So I think one of the fundamental problems is that, especially as character designers and people who are creating especially sort of entertainment products, especially in video games, where a lot of the training actually stems from, we're often going towards this sort of fifth grade reader level of understanding the world. And this is often something that's talked about in writing, where most newspapers are written for really low reading levels relative to what everyone is supposed to be at. And it kind of talks to this idea that kind of basically everyone is stupid and they can't really understand the nuance of any writing. They often have limited vocabulary. So a lot of newspapers, especially a lot of marketing, and most books are actually written specifically down to a low comprehension level of writing, which means they have less words, right? Very limited vocabulary, very limited sentence structure, very direct, right? And I think we can see obviously that a lot of video games follow this same pattern. And I'll unpack this later in the episode, but certainly, I think there's a lot of valid reasons for why we might want to create simplified worlds for video games where it's very clear who is the bad guy, who is the good guy, and that being able to functionally represent that easily and in a symbolic, iconic manner, right? Where we often talk about, hey, the bad guys are all spiky, right? The good guys are all kind of round and soft, and we can directly influence the way characters feel by making them feel evil or good or whatever it may be. And also that we can directly influence the way that people understand who they are by describing their functionality or changing their costumes. There's a huge variety of these things that you get taught as a budding character designer that are really valid for often video games and really simple applications. But I think this is a problem, right? Because if you're actually trying to create more nuanced things, often what happens is that these really simple ideas kind of bleed into like the cinema for adults, right? Where, you have a lot of superhero films and a lot of movies in general are really sort of dumbed down. And I guess this follows on from that basic idea that kind of, look, everyone's a bit silly, everyone's really basic. And we don't really want to complicate things, right? We want to make everything simple, everything easy to understand. And I think what happens is, quite frankly, a lot of people learn these ideas of character design going through entertainment design school, and then this just sort of becomes the truth, right? This becomes gospel, and you kind of can't go against it. And a lot of people just get into this sort of groupthink of like, this is what characters are. It's all about clarity. It's all about pushing the big shapes, and we kind of miss the nuance, right? And I think the problem there is that people actually love complexity. And I think there's a big separation between the ideas of complexity and nuance and creating characters that are complex and maybe don't exactly act the way that they look. I think that people, even at a 5th grade level, on a visual and a written level, really actually appreciate those concepts. And if we unpack a lot of what people really enjoy about character, it's often the nuances, right? Which is what I want to talk about next. Often the idea of complexity of character is well manifested in characters who are on the darker side of things, right? Who are more evil characters, who are straight out antagonists, or who are directly kind of anti-heroes, or characters like someone like Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones. And you could look at this as an example, both in the books and in the sort of TV version, right? Played by Peter Dinklage. And I think this is a good example where you see a strong contrast between the internal and the external aspects of the character, and the way that plays out is fascinating. And people really like these characters in general. In the Game of Thrones book, Tyrion was a very sort of fascinating character. He's meant to be a lot more ugly and a lot more deformed, I think, than the sort of TV, like live action representation of him. And just the complexities of that character, where they're dealing with their kind of forced external representation and the way that people feel about them, the way that people view them, the way that we view the things that he actually does, and then his internal dialogue. And sort of understanding a character like that is often what really makes people, grow a lot fonder to characters. And you can also have the real kind of deep evil characters, like someone like Hannibal Lecter, right? Where this is a truly evil individual, but it is the complexity of how people view them, how they're represented on the external side versus the things that they actually do and the things that they say. And it's a combination of these multiple aspects of the character, their external representation. You would have Hannibal Lecter's external representation when he's all calm, right? And he's not eating people. You would have the things that he does, which often are somewhat moral and somewhat completely immoral. And these are just fascinating characters where you see that there's nuance, and you're constantly having to balance and understand, like, who is this character? And every time there's a new chapter, they do something new happens where our view of them changes, and we're constantly trying to understand, like, who is Tyrion Lannister? Is he good? Is he bad? Exactly how? And I think this is just a fundamental part of how good characters kind of appear and how we sort of relate to them. And I think, obviously, looking at the more sinister characters, it's a much better representation of this, because often antagonists that have commendable qualities to them are very interesting, right? And they become very well known. Good other examples would be someone like your classic Darth Vader, right? Where we see him, and his external manifestation is of just this kind of dark edifice, right, of evil, right? Like, he has no expression. He has this kind of evil mechanical voice. Everything that he kind of does is, sort of immoral, based on power, based on selfishness. This is a character to fear. He doesn't have relationships with people. You get the feeling, like a shark, that you kind of couldn't negotiate with Darth Vader. But as the story progresses, obviously, if you know the kind of original trilogy, Star Wars, and some of the prequels, right, this is a nuanced concept and a nuanced character. And ultimately, it's his change as a character that defines a lot of that original trilogy and his relationship with Luke Skywalker. And that is why this is an enigmatic character. It's not because it's a good design visually. It's because of the internal versus external and looking at the choices that he makes and the way that he changes that makes him a fascinating character, right? That sort of lived the test of time, right? And is still interesting to us this day. Another good example, who I think is still like one of the best characters from literary history, would be like Long John Silver from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And this is another one of these characters where you kind of can't tell whether they're good or bad, right? Like, and yes, they do a lot of terrible things, but there is a way that that character really defines and helps to clarify, sort of Jim Hawkins, the main character, the protagonist of Treasure Island, really helps to kind of draw out a lot of these concepts of what innocence is, and how when people grow up they lose this innocence, and just what it would be like to be a pirate, basically, and not being able to trust anyone, and there not being quite so many rules, and having to constantly manipulate people by changing your outward appearance and what you do. And just a fascinating character that I think is like always interesting to contemplate, where there's true nuance there, where you kind of feel sorry for him, and also you're a little bit afraid of Long John Silver, and also you kind of despise him, right? And it's very hard to kind of see, right? Is there a hidden nobility there or not? On the other side of that, you might have a character like Luke Skywalker, who has a particular appearance. And often these characters who are very much about a hero's journey or a change, we kind of see this change coming, but it's exactly how they kind of resist a lot of this change. So Luke Skywalker kind of has a lot of these aspirations internally, where he wants to have a lot of power, he wants to be respected, he wants to be a great hero, he wants to kind of save the day. But his actual physical manifestation is of someone initially, if you look at sort of A New Hope, of just this kid, right, who is, a bit of a nobody, and he doesn't really understand a lot of this stuff. And it's the way that people kind of view themselves, right, in that sort of hero's journey versus the way other people react to them, that is, what is so interesting about that. And it's often these nuances that aren't always represented in the visuals that I think are so important to understand as a character designer. Because as a character designer, we often get told to, whatever the character is, just make that visible so everyone understands. And I think that's just one of the major problems here, is that you can look at a lot of these examples, and this is, as I said, typified by the antagonist characters, which are nuanced and complicated. But I think you can go through and look at, in all aspects of all the different characters in something like New Hope. I mean, you could take someone like Han Solo, another character that people seem to really like. It is the way that, he has a particular way that he views himself, that he sort of represents the world. And then you kind of see the way that different characters kind of view him. And this gives us extra insight, right? When someone has a lot of confidence and a lot of bravado, but then they run into trouble, right? It's the idea of the confidence man, and the external representation is not the entire representation of a character like Han Solo, right? He's presented visually as an adventurer, as this sort of confident person, but again, there's a lot of uncertainty there at a deeper level, and a lot of moral ambiguity as well that makes it a very, very interesting, compelling character. The key idea here is, it's actually really simple, is that often when we're designing the visual representation of a character, if you look at how that plays out with very interesting, nuanced characters, there is often a major difference between the way that they act and they behave and the way they view themselves and other people view themselves versus the facade that they put on, the way that we sort of view them and look at them. And this is what creates a multidimensional character that, again, lasts the test of time. You can read, if you're kind of interested in that type of story, like a coming-of-age story of a young boy, you can read Treasure Island 100 years later, more than 100 years later after it was written, and still connect with that character, because they show nuance that is deeply related to the human experience and the way you may have seen and known other people who are similar, and the way that this character and the interaction between Jim Hawkins and Long John Silver, the way that helps you understand your own experience of life. Now, this is, I guess, not all bad. This is not just 100% a bad idea to be able to create monodimensional characters and really understand how to, as I like to sort of describe it, to sing a clear visual note that can be clearly understood to say this is who this character at least appears to be. And I think it's often that in the beginning, if you're teaching students, which again, I have a pretty extensive experience trying to get people to kind of understand how to make compelling visual characters, teaching character design classes. One of the problems we face early on, and I certainly face this myself, is that we just don't create interesting looking characters, right? They just tend to look a little bit dull. And we have a lot of tools like creating different lineups and ways that we can sort of push the shapes and make things interesting and also make it really clear like who this character is. So one of the fundamental challenges that you face early on as an aspiring character designer is that it's hard for us to sing that clear visual note, to make it clear who this character is and what they're about. So we often design a range of characters and they kind of all look the same. It's hard to tell one from the other. And that really is just the end. That is death for any sort of creative project if you can't really tell who the characters are separate from each other. So we put a lot of effort into when we're teaching sort of entertainment design or character design to kind of get people off the ground and build this skill of like separating, differentiating, and working on a lot of these symbolic ideas. So often what happens, is that people also lack the knowledge to go deeper and do research and make their characters feel believable and functional, actually understand like what type of boots would your character wear, how are these clothes made, where do they come from? And, it's these kind of things that if you're designing a fantasy or a science fiction, you kind of have to understand. How is this spacesuit made? What's it made of? Is it made of something that we would have? Like, is it made of some futuristic material? Like, what are the qualities of that material? What is that like that we would understand? Would someone understand what a futuristic material would even be? Like, is there even any point in designing what a futuristic science fiction set of clothing would be? Because it might look like something that no one even understands. And that's where, again, you have to understand how do we communicate these things to the viewer and make something clear, make something that everyone understands. The same thing with a lot of medieval fantasy, going back to Game of Thrones, that there is, I guess, the reality of what people probably wore in a quasi-medieval fantasy land based on European Western history. And, then there's what people romanticize about it. Right? And often these things don't match. So you're often treading this line between believability, fantasy, functionality, symbology, iconography, and trying to create something that kind of works. And I think building these skills and building that muscle to be able to communicate that stuff effectively is super important, right? Like that is the first skill we build as a character designer. But I often think that when we are working in video games or these other projects that are often a little bit simpler, because in video games, there often isn't as much of a story, or if you were to analyze the idea of video games or entertainment properties like that, kind of the hero is the player is the hero essentially. And this changes the way that you represent the nuances of the world. And because there's exciting stuff happening, and you're sort of creating a journey of, a hero's journey of increasing your skills and ability within the game, learning different puzzles or whatever the game mechanics are, you kind of don't need the same degree of character. So often character is very simplified to facilitate a lot of those gameplay and character transitions that you actually create yourself. So some worlds have much more nuanced characters, but again, often very much centered around you as the player experiencing them as sort of separate. So you do tend to get much more simplified designs and stories and ideas in games, even though some of them go really deep and have very fascinating characters. But there is often a reason why we need to do this. And especially if you're looking at designs like kind of Mario, right, where, everything's kind of fun and happy, but you want to sort of show that some characters are enemies and some are maybe more dangerous enemies than others, and some people behave differently. Again, there's a huge variety of reasons why we need to build these skills as a character designer. I think the thing is just to understand that if you're actually looking at character in terms of writing your stories or making your own projects, that this is not the only thing you need to think about when you're designing your character, that you need to consider the external and also the internal aspects of who the character is. And I think that's just the main point that we need to make and understand here is if you can do both and create some nuance there, that's when you can really get magic to happen. I guess the main reason I think this is worth bringing up is that what I see out there talking to a lot of people about character is that a lot of the advice, a lot of the schooling, a lot of the education that I kind of talked about, and a lot of what we actually get trained to do, like you can get quite good at being a character designer, but you're kind of trained to be a cog in a machine, in a larger system. And often what happens is our job is to figure out how to be really clear, how to sing those clear visual notes of evil and good and comfort and discomfort, and to think about functionality and what things are made of, and to deal with all those problems, right? So that we present a visual design that is probably going to be watered down or made more nuanced later. But we kind of get trained to build that muscle of like external representation. And it tends to work pretty well for a lot of products that, again, need to be very obvious, very clear, very simple. And I think as artists, we often get separated from some of those other aspects of the process. And I think this is where, again, if you're interested in making your own things, or you're interested in going a little bit deeper, gaining a little bit more control, or I think just kind of adding more value to your production chain, the more you can understand these other aspects of character, the better. And I think it's just worthwhile exploring some of these ideas, because I think often what happens is you're actually pretty close to being able to create your own compelling characters and design your own worlds, but we're often missing some of this extra nuance and extra information that, is often handled by the writing teams or other people in the process. And I just want to sort of put this out there and talk about the difference between the external and internal representation of the character and the way that they combine to be in really sort of important ways. Because I think if you can just understand this, what you realize is you kind of have most of the skills already to create very compelling characters as a visual artist who's been trained to kind of make things look how they're meant to be. If you just add that nuance and think about the way the internal character is represented and how that contrasts with the external side, I think you can also design characters that are more nuanced and use your design ability to create things that actually have a little bit more sophistication in your sort of final product. A good way to think about this is that if you are designing the external aspect of a character, we're kind of designing who they are presenting to the world. And some people are just presenting exactly kind of who they are. They're functionally representing and showing you exactly their sort of work clothes. Some people are just very functional. They don't try and put on a facade. Other people do. Other people are very much about manicuring the way that they appear to the world, both in their actions and the things that they wear, the things that they do. And you can create very interesting scenarios and very interesting characters by contrasting that to the external things that they do or their sort of internal dialogue. So that really is the best way to view it, is that yes, we can be very simple, we can be very functional as artists, designing the external aspect of our characters, but that's just one aspect and one dimension of what you really need to do to create a character that people are going to be interested in reading about or watching even more. All right, let's do a couple of quick takeaways to see if we can kind of take all that stuff and maybe put it into some action steps and some things that you could go away and actually do. Firstly, I like to look at this from an analytical point of view, and I think the key here is just to understand that a lot of the advice you get out there is very industry specific. And for instance, even the way that characters will be designed and talked about in a more narrative-based industry like feature animation or TV serialized animation, it's very different to the way it gets talked about in video games. And even within video games, right? Different genres require different ideas. But still, I often find that when I came to say, hey, I want to design my own comic book or thing, that I was kind of missing a lot of this sort of basic information. And the other thing is that when you go and read a lot of books about writing, they talk about very different aspects of character, where obviously they're describing the external way that characters look versus their sort of internal dialogue or the things that they do. But it's very much about looking at what characters do within the story to help define their actual character. And I think you can often see this at work in, stories and comics and things like that are very visual, like sort of manga, where you really become enamored with particular characters because of, the specific things they do and the actions they take. So often story is really about designing choices that a character could make, and then you thinking about, what would I do in that same scenario? What would I do in that same situation? And then you're sort of fascinated and intrigued by the way that a character that you're reading about made a different choice or the same choice or whatever it is. And you thinking about what you would do either as you or as them, right, provides a lot of this context. And again, I think you'll find that if you sort of combine a lot of these different types of advice, you probably get to a much more nuanced, realistic idea of how you could create a character, not just a visual representation of it. And especially not just a visual representation that is really simple and kind of silly, like all the bad guys are spiky and black and all the good guys are kind of soft and glowing white. Fundamentally, also, I think it's worth saying that if we were to look at something formulaic that probably is going to be less formulaic, that might actually work, it's that often having a difference between the way a character looks and the way they behave and having nuance and contrast there is probably actually really good. This is probably one of the key things that is going to add that nuance and get you thinking about who that character really is. And it's those subtle things, I think, that draw us in and allow us to spend more time thinking about characters. And often that's really one of the main things that actually creates a lot of connection, right? Is just spending time thinking about them, being fascinated by the choices that they make. If you want a really simple way of looking at this, we could say that sometimes you're designing characters and things for clarity, and sometimes you're designing things for complexity, sophistication, and hidden meaning. If we look at a simple kind of what could you actually do, like a practical takeaway here, I think really look at characters you enjoy, specifically in the genres and the mediums that you're really interested in creating in, and become a student of how the external representation of that character is balanced by the internal representation of that character. And you can kind of see here that in a lot of really simple video game projects, it's all about the external representation of character. Often characters don't have an opportunity to make decisions, really. They're just baddies or goodies or NPCs, and it's really just important for us to navigate the visual aspects of those characters and know this is an NPC character. They probably don't have a lot of animation routines. They don't have a lot of personality, but we can kind of see who they are very clearly because the designer has really just put a stamp on it, right? Made it really obvious, right? The fisherman is holding a fishing spear. He's got a fishing net. It's full of fish. He's got a fish hook on his thing. He's got a hat, right, with a fish hook stamped on it. He's got like fish tattooed all over him, right? And it's like any way we can add fish and fisherman, right? Let's do it. And then people can be like, oh, that's the fisherman. But the more you can study when it comes to creating nuanced characters, specifically how the character appears on first blush, right? When you first see them, and how you kind of get to know them. And again, especially when you're seeing characters that you really enjoy and you really like, this is a real key because often we get introduced and we think about a character that we really like in one way, and it is the subtle way that they internally confound or confirm those initial impressions that allows us to understand them in a more nuanced way. And this is often also what allows you to rewatch a film. So if we go back to something really simple like Darth Vader, the next time that you watch the original trilogy and you see what Darth Vader is doing, you kind of understand that Darth Vader was Anakin Skywalker and that he has a redemption arc. And it allows you to kind of see that and rewatch that in a slightly different way. And once you kind of know the truth of a character, it's very hard to unknow that. So the trick is, as someone who's studying this, you really do have to go back and kind of look at like what was presented, like what made me feel a particular way about a character, and then what were the things that they slowly did to let me know more about them and allow me to connect with them and think about like why they're making those decisions, why they're doing those particular things. I think it's often this subtlety that we kind of miss the next time around. And it's often the reason why I think, like this is just sort of soapbox, but often the reason why sequels can become quite challenging, because we kind of already know a lot about the character, and it can be very challenging in that way to repeat that fascination, right? Unless people get very clear at understanding what those differences are between the external and the internal aspects of the character, and really sort of designing cool, interesting story moments around them, right? It's often why, it's just a little bit sort of flat. So anyway, the more you can think about this on an analytical level, the better. And just remember, again, it's good to build that muscle, right? So I would say continue to build those muscles of like making the fisherman a fisherman, right? Making the sheep herder a sheep herder, whether they are, sort of a really sort of far-flung modern science fiction sheep herder, or whether it is, someone from human antiquity, whatever it is. How do you communicate those things? How do you be symbolic? How can you just take a sledgehammer and just make that super freaking clear, right? So like anyone on Earth can understand exactly what's going on. That's a skill. It's really important. But so is all this other stuff. If you finally look at this from a philosophical or spiritual point of view, I think, again, the thing that fascinates me about character and a lot of these ideas and how I see different people in different industries talk about character, which is also a meta-analysis here, because the different ways that people view character tells you a lot about who they are and what they care about and the type of things they're going to make. Because, again, one of the things I've just sort of done is I've been a jack of all trades essentially throughout my career. So I've worked in comic books, and where people are very much interested in story, and specifically your story as an author, as a creator of the work, is like very important in sort of Franco-Belgian comics. It really is about telling a unique story that you care about, as would be writing a novel. And that's very different to a lot of the very highly transactional, highly obvious sort of designs that we would do in entertainment design, especially in video games. And I've worked in, animation, which is more narrative based, video games. And some video games, people really care about the story. Sometimes people care about the subtext and the meanings. Sometimes people don't. They're just like, we do not care about this at all. Just make it look cool, make it spiky. Like, let's just sort of turn all those dials up to 11 and everything else can just get lost. So everywhere sort of looks at this differently. And I think the key is that at our core, I think the idea of having to figure out what the difference between the external and internal aspects of people is just a fundamental part of being human. From a sort of evolutionary theory point of view, however you kind of view that, I think it's worth looking at that a lot of our survival as individuals and as a species or as subspecies on a tribal level would have been linked to, can you tell whether someone's lying to you? Here's the facade they're presenting. And people have been known throughout history to present facades for decades until finally they take advantage of that misunderstanding of who they truly are. And, everyone dies and something terrible happens because people couldn't figure out whether that character was actually going to help them or not. And I think this is one of those just drastically important things for humans to kind of look at. A lot of people are into gossip, right? Like here is the facade that a lot of celebrities present. And can we find the gossip? Can we find the truth? Can we find what's true about these characters and the facade they're presenting? Because everyone knows it's a facade. But again, sometimes people are really good at it. And sometimes you wonder, maybe they're really like that. Maybe it's all fake. So I think this idea is just fundamental, right? Like everyone is interested in that. And I think it's good to look at that because this is not something that exists on a 5th grade reading level versus a 9th grade reading level versus sort of being academic or whatever. These are just fundamental, really base truths about being human, understanding characters and the nuance. And I think everyone can really get down with this, and everyone really enjoys those characters who are nuanced and complicated and where you can't quite tell where they're going. And I think often we get when we are just a cog in a machine, we get a little bit separated from that, because our goal is just to create the external representation, and we let, sort of actors, animators, other people kind of deal with the nuance or the story aspects of it. But again, I think this is a really worthwhile thing to study and get interested in. But as I said in the beginning, this is not a formula. This is just me sort of pointing out a couple of things that I thought were interesting about the way that we view internal versus external character traits. Anyway, I think that's all we got time for on this particular episode. Let me know if this helps you think through the ideas of character, and especially as someone who is either a designer or you're aspiring to be a character designer. Hopefully this has helped you to think through some of the different advice you get. I've been thinking for a while about how to kind of add some different types of episodes and ideas to the Visual Scholar podcast, and I'm really going to try and lean into the idea of talking more about world building, creating our own creative projects, because I think that's a good way for us to discuss a lot of these ideas of productivity and how to manage larger projects, how to think about the creative tasks involved when you are trying to create either your own just little projects or your larger projects. And again, I think the more that we can think as sort of overall creators of things, the better, right? These ideas of character, I think, can really relate to you just creating a single illustration of character. It's often something like the Mona Lisa that's talked about, where we're kind of not quite sure what she's thinking, right? She has this really ambiguous expression. And I think ambiguity and hinting to the duality and the multifaceted nature of the characters that we draw, even if it's just a single illustration, I think can greatly enhance the way that your, potential viewers, people who like your work, can engage with what you're doing. So my goal is to make these ideas as applicable as possible to, whatever you're doing as an artist. But I think the more that we can learn to build our own creative projects, the better our careers are going to be and the more creatively fulfilled we're going to be. So anyway, let me know what you think of that. Other than that, catch you around on the next one.